They say the strongest hearts often belong to the most silent among us, men who've walked through storms but carry their scars beneath a steady gaze. On one ordinary morning in a small diner, Edward Malone, 81 years old and a veteran of a war few of the patrons remembered, sat alone in his regular booth. His boots were worn, his shirt faded, his hands unsteady, but his dignity was as sharp as ever. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The diner was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that made the clinking of coffee cups sound almost too loud. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, catching on the chrome edges of the tables and bouncing off the glass salt shakers. At the corner booth sat Edward Malone, an 81-year-old Korean War veteran who came here every morning at exactly 8:15. He wore his favorite plaid shirt, faded at the elbows, and a pair of sturdy boots that had seen more winters than most men in the room had lived through. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup of black coffee. But his eyes, though tired, carried the quiet dignity of a man who had once stared down fear in battle. He had settled into this routine, this small refuge of ritual and coffee, because after a lifetime of loud chaos, mornings like this were precious. Then everything changed. A younger man, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, was arguing with the waitress about his bill. His voice rose until it split the calm. Edward was watching, not seeking trouble, simply present in his routine. The younger man turned, noticed Edward, and in that moment something snapped. Without warning, he stormed over and struck Edward across the face. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Cups rattled, people froze. Edward, his cheek burning red, simply raised his hand to his face, stunned not by the pain, but by the cruelty of it. The diner seemed to stop breathing after the blow landed. Forks hovered above plates, conversations evaporated, and the hum of the morning was replaced by an awful silence. The waitress, her hands trembling as she clutched the order pad to her chest, begged the man to calm down, begged him to leave, but her words carried no weight against the kind of arrogance that feeds on fear. The thug stood there with a crooked grin, his chest heaving, daring anyone to challenge him. And yet no one moved. Some stared down at their eggs as if they could disappear into their plates. Others pretended to sip their coffee, desperate to be invisible. For them, it was safer to remain silent. For Edward Malone, silence carried a different meaning. He sat still, one hand cupping the cheek that now throbbed with pain, his other hand resting on the table beside the untouched mug of coffee. Edward didn't retaliate. He didn't rise from his seat, didn't curse, didn't even raise his voice. To those watching, it may have seemed like fear had frozen him. But fear was a language Edward Malone had long ago stopped speaking. He had known darker days. Days when bombs thundered overhead and comrades fell beside him, never to rise again. Compared to those memories, the sting of one man's slap was small. Yet what hurt Edward most in that moment wasn't the bruise forming on his cheek. It was the realization of how quickly dignity could be stolen, of how easily respect seemed to vanish in the face of arrogance. His heart ached not for himself, but for the world he saw reflected in that diner. A room full of decent people too afraid to stand up against cruelty. And so he stayed seated, because his legs felt too heavy to carry him away, and because, deep down, he knew this diner was the only place left that felt like home. The thug lingered near the counter, his smirk spreading wider as though striking down an old man had somehow proved his strength. Customers cast nervous glances in Edward's direction, guilt flickering in their eyes, but none dared step forward. They hated what they saw, hated their own silence, yet still they remained frozen in place. The diner that had once been Edward's refuge, the place where he was known simply as Mr. Malone, the polite veteran who tipped generously, even when his pension was thin, was now stained with the memory of violence. For Edward, that cut deeper than the slap. For everyone else, the shame of their inaction would linger far longer than the moment itself. The fragile silence of the diner was broken not by raised voices but by the faint jingle of the bell above the door. Heads turned, and the air shifted instantly. charged with something that made spine stiffen and hands grip coffee cups a little tighter. A group of men filed in, their presence alone commanding attention. Leather vests carried bold insignias stitched with care and pride, the kind of symbols that spoke of brotherhood and loyalty. Tattoos climbed down their arms, marking stories of 1,000 roads traveled, and heavy boots struck the floor with a rhythm that made every step feel deliberate. These were not ordinary patrons. They were members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. At their center walked a man taller than the rest, a figure whose gray-streaked beard gave him an unmistakable air of authority. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room not with curiosity but with intent. And then they stopped. They stopped on Edward Malone, the 81-year-old veteran who still sat at his booth, his weathered hand resting against a face that carried both pain and patience. Recognition moved between them like a current, unspoken yet undeniable. For Edward, whose eyes had dimmed over the years, there was a flicker of something caught between relief and sorrow. The man standing there at the center of the biker formation was Michael Malone, his estranged son. Time had carved distance between them, but blood has a way of binding even when words have failed. Across the diner, the thug who had slapped Edward only minutes earlier leaned casually at the counter, his arrogance undisturbed. He whispered to a friend still wearing the smirk of someone who believed his cruelty had gone unanswered, but Michael had already seen it. He saw the bruise on his father's cheek before he took another step inside. His jaw tightened, and the weight of unspoken anger settled over the room. The bikers who trailed behind him noticed it too. They didn't need an explanation. Edward's face told the story plainly. And so the diner froze once again, not from fear of a single man's violence, but from the silent understanding that retribution had just stepped through the door. Yet Michael did not rush forward. He did not storm the counter or unleash fury in the way some might have expected. Instead, he walked with deliberate patience, each step calculated until he reached his father's booth. He lowered himself across from Edward, the leather of his vest creasing as he leaned forward, and laid a calloused hand gently over the trembling one resting on the table. The room seemed to exhale, caught between dread and awe. For a long moment, no words passed between father and son. But the silence between them was not emptiness. It was filled with the bond that had never truly been severed, a connection carried quietly through years of distance, made visible now in the simplest of gestures. The thug finally turned toward the newcomers, his smirk growing wider as if he had discovered a stage for his arrogance. He laughed, his voice grating against the tense quiet. "What? You need your gang to protect you, old man?" he sneered, puffing out his chest as if defiance could shield him from what stood before him. For a heartbeat, the diner braced itself, unsure whether the morning was about to unravel into chaos once again. But Michael Malone did not rise from his seat. He remained steady, his gaze locked on the man who had dared to lay hands on his father. Behind him, the other bikers formed a silent wall, their presence enough to make even the boldest man think twice. Then Michael spoke. His voice carried no need for shouting. Its firmness alone commanded the room. "That man you laid your hand on is my father. He's an 81-year-old veteran who gave more for this country than you ever will. And you thought it was tough to slap him?" The thug's grin wavered, his bravado faltering under the weight of those words. The silence of the bikers, the stares of the customers, and the quiet strength radiating from Edward Malone became a force heavier than any blow could deliver. Slowly, realization crept into the thug's face. He shifted uncomfortably, the swagger draining from his posture. Without another word, he backed away, muttering something half-hearted before slipping out the diner's door. No one followed. His shame would follow him farther than any man could. Edward released the breath he had been holding, and for the first time that morning, a small, weary smile touched his face. His son had defended him, not with fists, not with violence, but with loyalty and respect. The bond that had long been strained seemed to find its strength again in that simple act. The waitress, still shaken, poured fresh coffee for the table, her gratitude soft and genuine. Around the room, customers began to murmur once more, the fear lifting as if sunlight had pierced through heavy clouds. Some approached Edward with words of respect, ashamed that they had stayed silent when he needed them most. Edward met their eyes with the same calm dignity that had always defined him. Then he looked to his son, his voice raspy but steady. "I fought battles long ago, Michael, but nothing compares to the fight of keeping your family close." Michael nodded, emotion flickering through the hardened lines of his face. From that day forward, the diner became more than a place for breakfast. It became a place of reconciliation, a symbol of the bond between father and son. Edward and Michael would meet there often, sometimes joined by Michael's brothers from the road, men who treated the veteran with a reverence he had never sought, but quietly cherished. And whenever Edward Malone stepped through that door, the memory of that morning lived on, the morning when cruelty was silenced not by fists, but by the quiet power of family and respect. And now we ask you, if you had been in that diner, would you have stood up for Edward Malone or stayed silent like the others? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.